Now, Brunei is today introducing severe penalties for homosexual sex and adultery, including stoning to death and whipping. In 2014, it became the first East Asian nation to adopt strict Sharia law, though later backtracked on the most extreme punishments. Well, celebrities such as George Clooney and Elton John have led the international outrage, while LGBTI icon Ellen DeGeneres has implored her Twitter followers to rise up. There's also been a call for a boycott of a luxury global hotel chain owned by Brunei's Sultan. Well, for more on this, I'm joined in the studio by Monash University law professor and the Deputy Director of the Custan Centre for Human Rights, Paula Gerber. Thanks, Paula, for coming in tonight.
My pleasure.
Now, can you tell us a little bit more in detail, what does this new legislation actually say?
Well, it's horrific, basically. It's barbaric. And I think the thing I'd like to really emphasise, first of all, is that it's not just about LGBTI people. Stoning, death by stoning, is also being introduced for adultery, for defaming the Prophet Muhammad. If you're found guilty of theft, you can have a hand or a foot cut off. These are just the most strict sentences that could be imposed for, in the case of LGBTI people, conduct that is protected under international human rights law.
Well, what do you make of the timing of this? Why do you think it's being introduced now?
That's a very interesting question. What we often see when countries start to crack down on LGBTI people is it's to divert attention away from something else that's going on. In Brunei, a very wealthy country, for the first time the economy is starting to go down.
Right.
So it's a good distraction. Instead of, don't look at the bad economy over here, look at our deviant LGBTI people over here. Let's target them instead.
And how do these new laws measure up against international human rights?
They're a complete violation of international human rights law. It was actually an Australian case, Tuna and Australian, where the United Nations Human Rights Committee said it is a breach of human rights to prosecute people based on their sexual orientation. So that was in the 1990s. So that's a given. Death by stoning. It is the most cruel and inhumane way to kill a person. They're buried up to their chest so they can't escape, and then they are just stones thrown at them by lots of people so that no one person knows who's thrown the stone that's killed them, and they end up as bloody stumps in the ground. It is just horrific.
And yet, what is also horrific is that Brunei is not the only country that treats homosexuality as a crime. It's one of 10 Southeast Asian nations that also punish.
It is. So there are 73 countries around the world where it's still a crime to be gay, and a lot of those are on our doorstep. 10, as you say, in Southeast Asia, 8 in the Pacific. And what's really interesting is that 35 of those 73 countries, so almost half, are Commonwealth countries. And Brunei is a Commonwealth country. So a lot of these laws are a legacy of colonisation. And one of the things that I think is very noticeable about the introduction of these laws in Brunei this week is that the Commonwealth has been silent. There has been no condemnation of these laws from the Commonwealth, and I really think they need to step up and be heard on this.
Well, how is Australia placed to exert some kind of influence over Brunei?
Well, we actually have a very strong trading relationship with Brunei. We are their 4th biggest trading partner. We are a member of the Commonwealth. We're a member of ASEAN, which Brunei is also a member of. So there are lots of diplomatic channels that we can be using. The other thing that's interesting is that Australia is now on the UN Human Rights Council, and Brunei is coming up for their periodic review later this year. So that's another opportunity for Australia and the world to condemn what Brunei is doing.
And what's the best way to address this issue at a regional level?
I think through the ASEAN framework.
Yep.
So there are lots of Asian countries that do still criminalise homosexuality, but they don't impose a death penalty. So I think we need to try and find some common ground, and maybe other Muslim countries can talk to Brunei and share their concerns about LGBTI people, but say that stoning to death is going too far. And I think it's also important to realise that they're not just targeting men who have sex with men. Lesbians are also being targeted, not with the death penalty, but with whipping and up to 10 years in jail for women who have sex with other women.
Meanwhile, I guess high celebrity profiles are also being outraged by this, and they're targeting the Sultan of Brunei. Why so, and what kind of influence can they have over these laws?
Well, the Sultan is the one who has passed these laws. He's been the leader of Brunei for 50 years, and there's talk that this is a bit about leaving a legacy behind for him. And condemnation like this can have a bit of a backlash. We saw it in Uganda when they clamped down on LGBTI people, and the West came down, in outrage, and it actually hardened their position. So we have to be really careful about these boycotts. I know that people are outraged and they want to do something, but often that's, Western people condemning is not the most effective measure, and perhaps other Asian nations, other Muslim nations, if we can get them to have the conversation with Brunei, that may be more effective.
Well, can you give us some examples of some Asian neighbours that are leading the way in LGBTI issues?
Well, Singapore's a really interesting example, because Singapore does still criminalise same-sex sexual conduct, but they have said that there's a moratorium on that. They're not ready to repeal laws, they're not ready to decriminalise, but they will say no one will be prosecuted. So I think that they'd be a good one that we could start having dialogue. There are a lot of countries that either have never criminalised or have repealed those criminal laws in Asia. Vietnam is one, and they could possibly be a useful ally. Indonesia is going through quite a homophobic stage at the moment, but they don't criminalise homosexuality. So there are other near neighbours that we could be talking to. Malaysia, which is actually borders on Brunei, unfortunately they seem to be going not as extreme, but certainly down the same pathway as Brunei in hardening their laws. And it almost seems to be a backlash as we see the West, more and more countries enacting marriage equality. Yeah. It's like, other countries that seem to be saying, well, we need to go in the other direction. And very clearly show that. In a way, moving quite in a backwards fashion rather than in a progressive way forward. Yes, we are seeing sort of, one step forward, two steps back in some cases. But, there are good news stories as well. Mozambique recently decriminalised, so did the Seychelles, so did Nauru. The Cook Islands is on the cusp of decriminalising. So whilst we do need to focus on Brunei, we need to celebrate the victories at the same time, and we also need to not ignore the other countries where the death penalty is actually used against LGBTI people, and Iran is an example that springs to mind. So Brunei's actually had a moratorium on the death penalty for any offences since 1957. So the optimist in me says that maybe, even though this law's been passed, they're not actually going to implement it and people aren't going to be executed. But in Iran, we see gay men being hung, being shot, being thrown off the top of buildings. As long as the law is there, it is a concern, isn't it? It absolutely is. And the message it sends to the rest of society, if the government says it's an offence that people can be murdered for, then that says to the rest of the society that they too can persecute and discriminate against LGBTI people. Okay, well, Paula, thanks a lot for coming in tonight to The World. Really appreciate it. Thank you for having me in here. Thank you. Paula Gerber there.